I keep a print of one photograph in my desk, glossy, a little sun-faded at the edges. 4 figures lined up at the trailhead arms, hooked sunrise cutting a white line along the pines. If you trace your thumb to the far right, there's a sliver of shadow taller than the tallest of them, standing just outside the frame, as if it chose to be barely seen. I didn't notice it that first week. Now I can't unsee it. Let me know where you're listening from and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. I've worked these rims most of my adult life. By late September, the heat eases back and the canyon breathes quieter. Buses run, but not as full. Engines hum down on Highway 64, tires whisper over the asphalt, and the cold at daybreak makes steam rise off fresh coffee the way breath fogs a barn window. My mornings were steady. Unlock the ranger station at 6:30, log the overnight traffic off Desert View Road, check the weather band, then take a slow walk to the trail counter near the south trailheads. When the air sat around 78 and the sky laid itself down in a clean blue sheet, I felt the kind of calm that convinces a person the world knows how to behave. I first noticed the 4 of them by their voices carrying through the door before I saw faces. The desk bell never rang. They were too polite to tap it. Sarah stood closest, a camera strap digging a gentle groove across her neck. She had that look artists carry when they're measuring light against time, squinting without realizing it. David unrolled the map he'd folded into a perfect rectangle and pointed with 2 fingers, not 1. He wanted to do it right. You could tell in the way he listened. Lena paced a lazy figure 8 around the lobby, boots already broken in hair, tucked under a cap that had seen a few storms. Mark hovered a step back with a thin black notebook in his hand, thumb pressed into the binding like a promise. The logbook lives in a shallow drawer beside the permit forms. That morning I slid it out and they leaned close. They wrote crisp, legible, like they were signing a guest book at a church wedding. 3-day loop. Water resupply at Ribbon Falls. Back before supper on the 3rd night, I stamped their permit and reminded them, like I always do, that the canyon is one thing going down and another coming back up. Sarah smiled and promised to ration photos as if pictures weighed as much as water. David checked the barometric forecast and nodded when I told him storms were unlikely but never off the table. Lena asked about the longer route and grinned when I said it would push their legs. Mark said thank you so quietly I almost missed it. Tucson moves on routines that suit its size. There's the diner on the corner where travelers eat too much breakfast because someone told them they'll need the fuel. There's the small grocery with sun-bleached posters for missing hats, lost sunglasses, and every kind of bug spray. That morning, the 4 of them took the corner booth under the elk photograph. I saw them when I stepped in for a refill, burrito halves open on their plates, napkins flattened into squares, salt and pepper moved to the side like chess pieces. Sarah aimed her lens at the glass of water where light made a trembling line. Dave counted fuel canisters with his lips, not his voice. Lena laughed, sharp, bright, quick. Mark wrote something down and turned his body so no one could read it like boys do on quizzes even when there's nothing to hide. I've learned to put names to people first by the sound they make in a room and only then by their faces. By that rule, Sarah was a click, a half-breath, and a shudder. David was the controlled rustle of paper under a steady hand. Lena was the skid of boot rubber on tile. Mark was the soft scratch of pen tip on pulp. None of it meant anything then except that this was a well-matched group, 2 leaders by habit, 1 by energy, 1 by silence, and that balance usually carries folks a long way. The morning had that soft, clean smell that comes after a night when the temperature drops into the 40s. Pine needles were still damp where shadows held them. Up on the rim, the view stretched the way it always stretches so far your eyes accept it in pieces. The canyon is every color of rust and sand, with the river a thread of metal hidden 2,000 feet down. People who don't know this place think it looks flat from above. It never is. It's a story in steps, and each step keeps its own secrets. We talked about water. We always talk about water. They planned 2 gallons each for the first push and a refill at the creek. I warned David that late September can play tricks with flow rates. He folded that caution into his plans like a man who saves instruction manuals in labeled folders. Sarah asked if dawn light down in the walls picks up more gold or more red. Depends on dust, I said. Lena said dust makes everything interesting. Mark didn't say anything. He looked past us all through the glass, through the trees, toward the path where rock turns to switchback and switchback turns to quiet. They took a tourist's photograph at the trailhead, but back then I only noticed the simple happiness in it. 4 young adults leaning together the way people do when they know each other's bad habits and love them anyway. Later, someone would show me that border shadow and my stomach would fold. But in the moment, it was just sun and skinny pine trunks and dust puffs at their feet like smoke from small fires. By 9:10, the parking lot had settled into the kind of silence that sits behind wind. I logged their departure, 4 hikers, 3 days ribbon resupply, and set their little index card into the silver rack by the radio. That rack is nothing fancy, just stamped aluminum with slots that slide. But it's a map of other people's promises, the time they expect to return the meals they plan to catch the children who think that next Saturday their parents will show them deer at dusk. I slid Sarah's card in first, then David's, then Lena's, then Mark's, edges lined up slots even. My own days stacked the same way. Paperwork until mid-morning. Patrol down the rim roads to watch for drivers too hypnotized by the view to notice the shoulder. A stop at the maintenance yard to check on a stubborn generator that needed coaxing to start when the temperature dipped below 45. Lunch on the hood of the truck, feet on the bumper, thermos balanced against my thigh. Then an afternoon walk out to the trail counter to read what the little metal wheel had to say about footsteps crossing into the wild. Clicks don't care about names. They only care that 2 feet went past and then 2 more and then 2 more after that. I crossed paths with the 4 once more that first day just after noon by my watch. They were a mile down, already moving well, that loose, efficient pace you only see in groups that understand each other's stride. Sarah lifted her hand without calling out. David pointed a thumb back at the rim like a man satisfied his plan survived first contact with reality. Lena didn't slow. She bounced in place the way runners bounce at red lights, impatient with standing still. Mark raised the corner of his notebook like it was a salute. "See you Friday," I said. They nodded like it was plain as daylight. The canyon that week felt settled. Mornings climbed from 52 to 78 without a jump. Afternoons held a little wind, not the kind that means trouble, just the kind that blows dust in your eyes if you take off your hat. The river's sound didn't reach to the rim, but I always heard it anyway, like a memory you can't shake. It was a fine stretch of days to move through rock and come back with tired legs and something good to talk about over stew. You don't dismiss local stories when you've stayed long enough to watch them shape how folks behave. Tour drivers trade tales at the gas pumps, how late light makes the canyon sing where the mule deer cross at dusk, which overlook Rattle's railings after dark. Some swear the caves east of the main corridor bend sound sideways so that your own voice shows up behind you when you're standing still. I've stepped inside those mouths plenty of times and never found anything except cold air and the hush that waits where light refuses to go. Still, I tell visitors the same thing I tell myself. Be mindful of places that ask you to listen. That afternoon, I checked the No AA band again. No storms flagged. Pressure steady wind, 5 to 8 miles per hour out of the west. A few high clouds, the kind that mean nothing except shade when you need it. I set a sticky note on my radio with their card numbers and wrote "Fry dinner" on the top edge so I'd remember to be at the desk when they came back through. I enjoy those short conversations, the way dust wears a person's face into a different version of itself, the way laughter loosens shoulders after miles, the way a cold can of soda can taste like a secret. In small towns, you learn to read changes that have nothing to do with paper or radios. The woman at the diner keeps a sharper eye when a day feels off. The guy at the grocery rearranges the bottled water display closer to the door. The teenage clerk at the station squints toward the south when the wind clocks around. That Thursday evening, none of those little rituals happened. Folks moved easy. The porch at the rental cabins filled with chairs and soft talk and porch lights winked on one by one like the start of a slow parade. When the sun slid behind the pines, the air fell to 52 faster than the night before. I stood in the doorway of the station and breathed the kind of cold that tastes clean enough to drink. A coyote trotted along the maintenance fence line with the purposeful gait of an animal that knows every turn in a mile. Headlights drifted into the lot, then out again. Laughter rose in little bursts and fell quiet as people headed to bed. I flipped the trail counter report into the folder and wrote the day's number onto the whiteboard behind the desk. My pen left a dark line that dried matte. I glanced at the silver rack. 4 cards sat in their slots, right side up edges even. Nothing out of place. I set the radio on its base to charge heard the small click that says electricity has found the right path and rinsed my mug in the sink. Some nights I cut across the lot and drive home. Other nights I sit with the light off and let my eyes adjust to the dark. That evening I stayed elbows on the desk, fingers steepled, listening to the thin whistle of wind thread the door seal. Out past the glass, the trailhead sign caught the moon just enough to shine a narrow silver edge. A moth batted at the window screen twice and gave up. The clock above the map ticked tiny and particular, the second hand hopping the way human things hop when we try to be as steady as the earth. A little after 9, Tessa called to say she'd seen the 4 at breakfast and they'd been the right kind of excited. I told her I agreed. She laughed in that soft way people laugh when they don't know yet they'll need that sound later. We said goodnight. I set the phone back in its cradle and stood to turn the bolt on the door. On my way out, I checked the porch light and left it burning the way we do when a late crew's still on the trail. Back across the lot, my breath made a thin white ribbon in the cool air. I looked once toward the tree line and once toward the road, and both looked the way they always look at that hour, still decent, faithful to habit. I started the truck and let the engine warm. In the rearview mirror, the station window was a small square of gold on a dark line of buildings. It glowed steady. Then, just for a heartbeat, it seemed to dim and brighten again as if someone had passed between the desk lamp and the glass. I watched until the light smoothed out. Then I drove home under a clean spread of stars, thinking about the photograph I'd taken of my wife the summer we met, and about 4 index cards lined up like tomorrow's weather, and about how I'd swing by the desk a little earlier the next morning just to be there when familiar footsteps came up those wooden stairs and the door hinges sighed the way they always do. That Friday morning started the same way every other one had that fall coffee. A quick weather check, a note on the board about wind speeds, but by noon, something in the rhythm had shifted. Out here, you can feel absence long before you can prove it. The trails have a pulse. When it skips, you know. The 4 were due back by mid-afternoon. Their cards sat neat in the rack, same as always, but the air had that stretched kind of silence that creeps in when something's late. I told myself they'd just taken an extra hour to climb out, maybe stopping for pictures. People underestimate that last mile. It's uphill both ways in the imagination. By dusk, the porch light threw a weak cone across the gravel lot, and still no sign of them. That was when I called Tessa at the south entrance. She told me she hadn't seen any movement on her end either, just the usual tourists heading home. We agreed to give it until morning. That night, I stayed at the station. I do that sometimes, but this time it wasn't habit. It was that itch at the base of the neck, the one you get when something isn't where it should be. Around midnight, the wind came up sharp off the rim. It rattled the flag outside and pressed against the windows in long, low breaths. The clock ticked too loud. I walked the porch, once flashlight cutting the dark half, expecting to see headlights bouncing up the road. There was nothing but the faint gleam of frost starting to gather on the railings. I tried to read a book but kept glancing at the radio, waiting for static to turn into a voice. It didn't. By sunrise, I filed the report overdue. Party 4 hikers last seen Wednesday morning. We started simple an air check over the loop trail, a ground team down from the rim. When the helicopter lifted off, the noise rolled across the canyon like thunder. The wind kicked up dust devils around the parking lot, spinning grit into the air. I watched them disappear over the trees and told myself, as I always do, that most of these things end with embarrassment, not tragedy. 90% of the time, folks show up tired, sunburned, sheepish. They wave, say, "We lost the trail for a bit," and I stamp them back in. But when the pilot radioed after the first pass, no movement, no signal, no smoke, it felt like the canyon had swallowed its own echo. By noon, we had boots on the trail. I joined the second team down toward Ribbon Falls, where the loop comes tight against the rock face. The air smelled like iron and wet clay. We moved slow, calling names that bounced off the stone and came back flat. The canyon has its own kind of quiet. It doesn't fall on you, it seeps. About a mile and a half down, we caught sight of nylon against the earth. It was color that didn't belong, faded blue and orange where everything else was rust and sand. I called it in and we moved toward it. The campsite was still. That's what I remember most. It didn't feel like a place abandoned in a hurry. It felt like a place paused mid-breath. 4 tents set in a neat half-circle, zippers drawn guy lines taut. The ground around them untouched, no scuffs, no prints. A kettle rested cold beside the stove, a thin line of water dried in the spout. There were footprints coming in sure 4 pairs, but none leading out. Sarah's camera lay on her sleeping bag, the strap coiled like a sleeping snake. David's maps were pinned under a small rock, corners curling just slightly from dew. Lena's boots sat side by side outside her tent socks, folded inside like she'd meant to put them back on. Mark's notebook rested open on a stone, a few lines blurred into gray from moisture. I've stood in a lot of strange camps over the years, lost hikers folks panicking mid-trip, even a few that didn't end well, but I'd never seen anything quite like that. It was too perfect. No drag marks, no scattered gear, no sign of a storm tearing through. Just order left behind in a place that doesn't keep order for long. I felt it under my ribs before I could name it wrong, deep wrong, like stepping into a photograph instead of a campsite. One of the younger rangers, kid named Louise, said it out loud. "Feels like they'll walk back in any minute." No one answered. We ran the usual checks, searched 100 yards out, flagged a perimeter, radioed coordinates. The dogs came in that afternoon, 2 older shepherds that know their job better than most people I've worked with. They sniffed, circled the camp once, then twice. Both lay down and wouldn't move forward. Their handlers called to them, coaxed, but the animals kept their noses low and their tails stiff. I saw that once before during a cave recovery up north when gas pockets turned the air strange. I checked the readings. Nothing. The air was fine, cold, dry, unremarkable. By the second day, the families arrived. They came quiet, carrying photos and exhaustion like luggage. Sarah's mother wore a camera strap of her own empty. David's brother asked about maps, wanted to see where we'd looked. Lena's father stood off to the side, staring down at the canyon, as if sheer will could make it give back what it took. Mark's parents didn't say much. His mother held a thermos that steamed but never seemed to empty. We set up a base at the rim. Reporters came too, then volunteers, church folks, hikers, people from Flagstaff and Page who just wanted to help. We stretched lines down the canyon, gridded sections, ran thermal sweeps. Nothing moved but the wind. That third night, the wind changed direction. Out here, sound travels in odd ways. It bounces, folds, gets caught between walls. Around midnight, a few of us sitting near the fire thought we heard a laugh carried down the ridge. It wasn't a clear sound, more like the memory of one. The younger volunteers looked spooked, but I chalked it up to echo. Still, when the sound came again higher up and faint, even the radio chatter went still. I walked to the edge with a flashlight and let the beam fall into the dark. The canyon gave nothing back, just black air and the faint drip of water far below. By dawn, we pushed the search outward. Teams swept every path within 3 miles of the campsite. One group found a small handprint in the dust along a ledge too defined, too narrow for an adult. Could have been from one of them, could have been there for weeks. The stone holds prints longer than the mind can justify. Nearby, we saw a gouge deep straight like something clawed against the rock. I took a picture and kept my mouth shut. Out here, superstition spreads faster than truth. That afternoon, Tessa brought up the old local talk, the Whispering Caves. I'd heard the stories since my first year. People said you could hear your own name if you stood in the right place long enough, and that sometimes it didn't sound like your own voice coming back. We'd found the missing group's camp less than a mile from that stretch. I told her we'd check it, but quietly, no reason to feed gossip. She nodded, but I could see the doubt working behind her eyes. The 4th day, clouds began to build over the north rim. Not big ones at first, thin layers like smoke trails, but by late afternoon they stacked heavy. We got the alert from NOAA isolated thunderstorms, short but severe. I called the teams back. Some didn't make it to the rim before the rain hit. The first drops were cold enough to sting. Within minutes, it turned into a downpour, the kind that erases trails faster than you can flag them. The ground turned slick, and water poured through gullies that had been dry an hour earlier. The canyon makes its own rivers when it wants to. From the station window, I watched brown torrents cut down the walls carrying brush and gravel. The sound was like low freight, steady and endless. Radios crackled with check-ins, static voices fading in and out. A few words stuck, rockslide washed out, pulling back. I couldn't shake the thought that somewhere out there, under all that water and noise, those 4 tents still stood just as neat as we'd found them. When the rain stopped the next morning, the canyon was unrecognizable. Trails we'd marked were gone, replaced by fresh cuts of earth. We started over, retracing with GPS, but everything felt shifted. The air smelled metallic, like a coin pressed to your tongue. That's when Tessa called out she'd spotted something wedged between 2 stones just below the campsite where runoff had carved a narrow gash. I climbed down beside her. It was small black, soaked through, but still intact, a notebook. The cover soft as cloth from years of wear. Mark's name pressed faintly into the corner. We dried it by the fire that night, turning pages with gloved hands. Most of the writing had bled into blue shadows, but every few pages words clung to the paper. Supply lists, sketches of plants. Then the tone shifted, broken lines, fragments colder here, echoes wrong, something's down here. The phrase repeated over and over, scrawled deeper each time until the ink tore the paper. At the back, a crude map in red pen showed a route none of us recognized, winding past the marked trails into a narrow pocket of canyon we didn't have on any official grid. Someone had penciled a single note beside an X, "Don't follow." I remember looking around the firelight then at the faces of my team. No one said a word for a long time. The crackle of wet wood filled the space between us. Finally, Tessa spoke. "It could be a warning," she said. I nodded, though part of me was already wondering if it was something else. Curiosity has a sound. It's the faint click of a lighter in a dark tent. That's what I heard then. By morning, the decision was made to send a small team, just 4 of us, to check the area marked on the map. We packed light enough for a single day. I folded the page, slid it into my jacket pocket, and zipped it shut. The sky was pale gray, the kind of color that promises neither storm nor sun, just uncertainty. We moved out at first light, the canyon floor damp under our boots, air cool and heavy. None of us spoke much. The path narrowed the farther we went, the walls rising until the light felt strained. The sound of our footsteps turned hollow. We reached the opening by mid-afternoon. It didn't look like much, just a split in the rock where shadow pooled deeper than it should. The air that came out was colder, almost damp, like water running behind stone. I paused, hand against the wall. It thrummed faintly the way it does when wind pushes through unseen gaps. Behind me, Tessa muttered, "You hear that? I told her it was just the canyon breathing, but I wasn't sure I believed it." We didn't go far that first time, just far enough to mark coordinates and leave a glow stick near the entrance. Inside, the air swallowed sound so fast that even our own breathing felt wrong. The walls were etched scratches, maybe symbols, maybe just erosion, but they caught the beam of my flashlight in ways that made the marks shimmer. When I called out once, my voice came back half a second late, thinner, unfamiliar. That was enough for me. We turned back while the light still reached the ground. By the time we climbed out, the sun was slipping behind the rim, and the temperature had dropped fast. I looked back once at that opening and thought I saw the faintest motion just beyond the line of light, a shimmer, maybe dust. I told myself it was the heat leaving the rock. I wanted to believe that. But that night, back at base, when I laid the map out on my desk, I noticed something I hadn't before. The red X wasn't drawn over the hollow. It was drawn just beside it. And in tiny writing along the edge, words almost lost to the smudge of time left at the split, "The door moves." I didn't sleep much after that. Every time the wind pressed against the building, the walls made that same low hum, the same one I'd felt under my hand at the hollow. I told myself it was only the storm residue shaking the canyon's ribs, but deep down I knew the search had changed. This wasn't about finding lost hikers anymore. It was about understanding what exactly had found them first. We didn't go back into the hollow right away. That's one thing folks misunderstand when they read about these cases years later. They imagine we pushed straight into the dark like it was a movie that we had answers waiting just behind the next turn of the rock. But out here in real life, you pause. You let the canyon breathe and you listen to what it's telling you. For 3 days we listened. The rain had carved the slopes raw again, and every step sent pebbles clicking down into the basin. The air had that sharp mineral scent that lingers after a flood, and the trails still bled mud. The families stayed close to the Rim Eyes hollow from waiting. Reporters packed up when nothing new came out of our mouths. Only the volunteers remained moving through the cold, with that dogged patience that feels like prayer. On the 4th morning, I unfolded Mark's map again. The paper had stiffened from drying by the fire. My thumb traced the crooked lines, the ones curling around that jagged X, and I found myself whispering the words scribbled beside it, left at the split "The door moves." I don't know why I said it out loud. Maybe I wanted to hear it sound foolish in daylight. Tessa caught me at it and raised an eyebrow. "You think it's a riddle?" she asked. Or directions. I didn't have an answer. It could have been either. It could have been nothing. But by afternoon, the teams had stopped finding even the faintest trace of the hikers, and silence was beginning to take over. When silence gets too loud, people start filling it with whatever they can. That night, by the fire, the talk started turning strange. A few volunteers swore they'd heard laughter echoing through the canyon, soft, carried by wind that came from no direction they could name. One of the younger guys, Ellie, said it sounded like a woman's voice, maybe Lena's, repeating something over and over. The sound rose and fell like it was being dragged through water. I told her wind does that especially along the south walls. She nodded, but I could see she didn't believe it. When I lay down later, I couldn't stop thinking about the way sound bends out here, the way it folds in on itself. Every echo carries pieces of someone else's voice. That's the trouble with this land, it remembers more than it should. By sunrise, I'd decided we had to follow the map. The higher-ups wanted another week of grid searching, but I knew we were wasting daylight. I chose 3 people to go with me. Tessa, Ellie, and Louise, the same ranger who'd found the first camp. We carried light packs enough for 1 day, plus a radio spare batteries and a coil of rope. The sky hung gray but steady, the kind of color that makes you believe you'll get a full day before weather turns again. I told the families before we left. Sarah's mother touched my arm and said, "Bring something back. Anything." I promised I would. I shouldn't have. We started before 7 boots crunching through damp grit, our breath fogging in the cool air. The trail narrowed the deeper we went. Canyon walls climbed higher, cutting out most of the light. Every step felt like walking through an hourglass. I led the line, keeping an eye on the compass. The farther in we went, the quieter the world became, until even the sound of our own footsteps seemed too loud. After 2 miles, the walls pinched inward and split into 2 narrow paths. One curved right, shallow and smooth, the other left and darker like a throat carved by centuries of water. I stopped there, staring at that darker path, and heard my own voice again, left at the split. The air changed the moment we stepped in. Cooler, yes, but thicker too, like the stone itself exhaled. The smell was damp clay mixed with something faintly metallic. Our headlamps cut narrow cones through the dark, catching bits of quartz in the walls that blinked like eyes when light touched them. Ellie walked a few paces behind me, whispering the coordinates into her recorder. Tessa marked the wall every 50 feet with fluorescent tape, even though half the strips refused to stick. The farther we went, the stranger the echoes became. Our voices came back slower, lower, like we were hearing ourselves from underwater. I called out once just a simple, "Copy that," and it returned as something drawn out and unrecognizable. Louise muttered, "That's not just echo." We came to a hollow space maybe 40 feet wide. The floor sloped unevenly, littered with small stones and something that looked like ash. When I knelt and brushed it with my glove, the gray came off on my fingers in fine powder. I don't know why, but it felt warm even though the air was cold enough to sting. I told myself it was friction from the rock, or maybe heat trapped in a vein of mineral. Still, I wiped it off faster than I needed to. Ellie shone her light up along the wall. There were marks etched there, spirals, lines, and circles. Some shallow, some deep. Old, maybe ancient, but too deliberate to be random. "Could be native," she said, but her voice wavered. "Could be graffiti?" I said back, though I'd never seen anyone mark stone like that. We went deeper. The tunnel bent right, then left, then opened again into another pocket. This one felt heavier somehow. The air pressed against us, and even the lamps seemed dimmer. There was no sound except the slow drip of water somewhere far away. We found a torn strap from a backpack wedged in a crack. The nylon was familiar, the same gray and blue pattern used on Mark's pack. I turned it over in my hands and felt the thread frayed clean through, not cut. It looked like it had been pulled until it failed. I slipped it into a sample bag and marked the coordinates. Ellie wanted to keep moving, but I told her we'd gone far enough for the first run. She argued until Tessa touched her shoulder and said quietly, "Listen." We all froze. From somewhere ahead, faint but unmistakable, came a sound like breathing. Not wind, not dripping water breathing. Slow, steady, human. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. We stood there in that cold, black air, listening to our own hearts pound. Louise's radio crackled suddenly, and we all jumped. It was the base station checking in, but her voice shook when she answered. We turned back then, one step at a time, until we saw daylight again. When we emerged, the sun had dropped lower than I realized. The world outside felt too bright, like stepping out of a dark theater. Back at camp, we logged everything. The brass at headquarters wanted to send in a full geological team, but I argued for one more small entry first. I didn't want to turn that place into a circus until we understood what we were looking at. They agreed, though, reluctantly. That night, the canyon was so still it seemed to be holding its breath. The wind had gone elsewhere, and even the insects were quiet. I lay awake in my cot, the sound of that breathing looping through my mind, steady as a heartbeat. The next day, we returned with better gear, fresh batteries, a second rope oxygen monitors. We went in early, tracing our steps to the spot where we'd turned back. The air was cooler than before, almost clammy, and our voices faded faster. This time we followed the tunnel another 100 yards until it split again. To the right, a narrow chute descended toward what looked like a drop-off. To the left, the walls curved into a larger chamber that flickered faintly when our lights hit it. The shimmer turned out to be moisture beating on smooth stone, but it gave the illusion of movement, like the wall itself was breathing. That's where we found the backpack wedged into a low crevice. It was half buried in silt, but intact. The tag on the zipper read, Sarah W. We laid it out on a tarp and opened it slowly. Inside were a cracked camera, a damp journal, and a small flashlight corroded green at the seams. The journal's first pages were ruined ink melted into blue clouds, but farther in a few sentences had survived. One line written large read, "The echoes are getting closer." Another said Mark can hear them even when it's quiet. After that, the ink trailed off into smudges. Tessa whispered, "What did they find down here?" No one answered. We marked the site and packed everything up. The chamber beyond the crevice narrowed again into a slit too tight for us to pass safely. I tied a marker at the point where the light failed and told the team we were heading back. None of them argued. On the way out, I thought I heard something following our footsteps, a faint scuff just behind mine. When I stopped, it stopped. I didn't mention it. The mind plays tricks in enclosed spaces. You learn to ignore the ones that don't leave proof. The official search wound down over the next few weeks. By December, winter took hold and the canyon turned to steel. Most of the volunteers went home. The families stayed through the last debrief, their faces set like stone. I stood in front of them and said the words no one ever wants to hear, that we had to suspend the search until spring, that conditions were too dangerous to continue. Sarah's mother didn't cry. She just nodded once and said, "If you hear anything, you call me first." I told her I would. She didn't believe me, and I didn't blame her. After everyone left, I walked back to the rim one last time. The trailhead sign was half buried under frost, and the sky had that hard white look that comes before snow. Down below, the canyon looked quiet, but not peaceful. Quiet the way a deep lake looks still before it swallows something. I stood there for a long time, hands in my pockets, watching the wind move faint patterns across the dust. Somewhere in the hollow behind that split in the stone, a single strip of fluorescent tape glowed faintly in the dark, marking the place where our light had stopped. I thought about that line on Mark's map, "The door moves," and wondered whether it was warning or confession. A few weeks later, the first snow came heavy, sealing the canyon in white. The trails closed. The radio calls went back to routine car trouble, stray mules, broken fences. Life moved on, at least for everyone else. But some nights when I sat alone at the station, the wind would shift through the vents and carry a sound I couldn't quite name. Not words exactly, just a tone low and rhythmic, like someone breathing slow and patient in the dark. I'd get up, walk to the window, and stare out at the canyon, black and endless. The sound would fade, but the feeling stayed, the sense that the story wasn't finished, that something down there was still waiting for its turn to speak. Winter passed slow that year, the kind of slow that feels personal. Snow held the rim like a wound that wouldn't close, and for months the canyon lay quiet under ice. I stayed through the season half out of duty half because I couldn't seem to leave. Most of the others rotated to different parks or took desk work until spring, but I kept finding reasons to stay near the hollow. The search had gone still, but the story hadn't. The families called, sometimes soft voices asking if I'd heard anything new. I told them the truth, nothing yet. What I didn't tell them was that even with the radio silent, the place itself kept talking, not with words, just sounds. Long after the winds died, I'd hear faint pressure in the air like a deep note played from inside the stone. By April, the thaw came sudden. The snow melted almost overnight, feeding every dry creek into a rush of brown water. When the sun returned, it felt harsh, unfamiliar. That same week, we got a call from a gas station clerk in Tucson. She said a man had come in, barefoot clothes torn to shreds, skin burnt, muttering nonsense. When she described him, thin, dark-haired, about mid-20s, it was like hearing a name I'd buried. I drove there myself, lights off, siren quiet. He was sitting on the curb when I arrived, knees drawn to his chest, eyes half shut against the light. His hands trembled, but not from cold. Someone had draped a blanket over his shoulders. The paramedics were waiting, but they looked as unsure as I felt. When I crouched beside him, he turned his head just slightly, and I saw the initials tattooed faintly along the waistband of his jeans. MC. I didn't need to see the photo to know. It was Mark Connolly, 7 years gone and somehow alive. The hospital took him in under heavy sedation. He was dehydrated, half-starved body weight, down nearly 40 pounds from his original records. I sat outside his room that first night listening to the monitor beeping steady as a clock. The doctors kept asking the same questions. Where had he been? How had he survived? But his eyes just stared past them, fixed on something none of us could see. When Tessa came in around midnight, she stood at the foot of the bed for a long time without speaking. Finally, she said, "He looks like he hasn't left the canyon at all." She was right. He didn't look rescued. He looked unfinished. For the first 2 days, he barely spoke. His voice came out rough, a dry whisper that didn't travel far. When he did say something, it was fragments, not water, not home still there. The doctors chalked it up to trauma, maybe delirium. But when he finally turned toward me and met my eyes, there was a sharpness that didn't belong to confusion. It was recognition. I asked him if he remembered the trail, the storm, anything from that September morning. His lips cracked as he tried to answer. Then he whispered, "It let me go." That's when I called the families. There's no right way to tell people news like that. Sarah's mother wept on the phone until her voice broke. David's brother said nothing for a long time, then asked, "Did he say where they are?" I told him no. Not yet. And Lena's father, he only said, "You'll watch him, won't you?" I promised I would. The third night, a storm moved in from the west, soft rain at first, then wind against the hospital windows. I was still in the hallway when I heard Mark's voice for the first time, low but clear. He was sitting upright, shaking eyes wide open. "I can tell you what happened," he said. I went in, shut the door behind me, and sat down beside his bed. Tessa joined a minute later. We didn't turn on the recorder right away. It didn't feel right. He started slow, like someone trying to remember a dream before it slips away. He said the rain had come fast that day, the one we saw in the records, the flash flood that cut through the lower trails. They'd tried to outrun it, followed Lena through a crevice in the rocks that looked shallow but opened wider inside. It was dry, he said, but it didn't sound dry. He described a space that bent sound in every direction, walls that seemed to pulse as if breathing. At first we laughed, he said. We thought it was echo. He stopped talking for a long time after that, eyes flicking toward the far corner of the room. I almost asked what he was looking at, but something about his face made me keep still. When he started again, his voice was different, lower, steadier, like a man telling something he wished wasn't true. He said the echoes started to talk back, repeating their names, but not in their own voices. David called for Sarah once, and the voice that answered was wrong, too deep, too close. They tried to climb out, but the path had changed. "It's like it moved," Mark said, "like it wanted us to stay." His breathing grew shallow, and for a moment I thought he'd fall asleep. But then he turned to me and whispered, "I left them." The words barely formed more air than sound. "It let me go," he said again. Tessa's hand froze halfway to the notebook she'd been holding. "What let you go?" she asked quietly. He just stared at her, the corners of his eyes trembling, then looked away. We tried to verify what we could. The area he described matched the hollow, though his details didn't line up with our maps. He said the cave twisted in ways that didn't make sense, that their lights failed one by one, that time stretched and folded. None of it fit the kind of survival record we know no gear could last that long underground. And yet he was sitting there, heart beating steady. The doctor said his body told one story, and his mind another. 7 years on paper, maybe a week in his memory. Over the next few days, the media got wind of it. Reporters waited outside their vans lined up along the curb antennas tilting toward the wind. The families returned to town clinging to hope, and the hospital board brought in psychologists. But through it all, Mark refused to say more. He'd wake at night whispering to himself. Sometimes he'd reach toward the corner of the room, fingers moving like he was trying to trace something in the air. The nurses said he slept with his eyes half open. One evening when I checked in on him, the room smelled faintly of wet stone. I don't know how else to describe it, that smell of minerals and cold air that clings to the canyon after rain. The window was closed, yet it lingered. Mark was awake, staring at the wall, lips moving. "It's hungry," he said. "It doesn't eat. It waits." I asked what he meant, but he didn't answer. 2 days later, he told Tessa and me the rest, or what pieces he could still find. The group had split up after days of wandering. David disappeared first. No sound, no struggle, just gone. Then Sarah stopped speaking. Lena tried to keep them moving, but the tunnels had changed again. He said it was Lena who finally understood what the place wanted to trade. "One for the rest," he murmured. He said she stepped forward into the dark, and the stone seemed to open, not crumble or fall, but open like a curtain pulled aside. After that, Sarah faded slow as a dying flame, and then it was just him, alone. He didn't remember leaving, only waking under sunlight that hurt his eyes. "It chose," he whispered. By then, the doctors wanted him transferred to a larger facility, maybe Phoenix or Flagstaff someplace with psychiatric staff. I didn't argue, but I stayed that night long after visiting hours, sitting in the hallway. Around 3 a.m., a nurse came running out of his room. She said the lights had flickered. The temperature dropped nearly 10 degrees. When I went in, Mark was sitting upright again, wide awake, calm. The monitor beeped steady, but he was whispering. "You hear it too," he said. It followed me out. He passed all the medical checks the next morning. Heart rate, normal oxygen, fine, no sign of infection or fever. The only thing that changed was the air in that room. It felt dense cold even in full sunlight. The staff said it was faulty ventilation, but when I stood there, I could feel it pressing against my skin, a kind of quiet pressure, as if the canyon itself had found a way inside those walls. By the end of the week, Mark was stable enough to release. He asked to stay near the park, said he needed to see the sky again. We set him up in a small cabin near the ranger station, close enough that I could check in on him daily. He spent most of his time sitting outside at dusk, staring toward the ridges. Sometimes I'd see his lips move, though he didn't make a sound. One evening, he motioned for me to sit with him. The air was still the sun low enough to paint the cliffs red. He said, "It isn't gone." "You know that, right?" I didn't answer. He looked down at his hands and smiled, small, tired, not unkind. "It needs memory," he said. "As long as someone remembers, it stays fed." Then he stood and went back inside. I didn't see him for the rest of the night. Later after dark, a maintenance worker radioed in saying a light was on at the old south overlook a mile from Mark's cabin. I drove out there myself. The beam from my truck cut through dust and brush, catching bits of quartz in the sand. The overlook was empty, except for a single lantern left burning near the rail. Below, the canyon stretched wide and black. For a moment, I thought I saw movement far down the slope, a flicker of pale light like a reflection deep under water, but when I blinked, it was gone. When I returned to the cabin, Mark was asleep or pretending to be. His face was turned toward the window, eyes half open again. The next morning, he told me he dreamed of Lena, said she was standing at the mouth of the hollow, smiling, beckoning him back. I asked if he thought she was alive. He shook his head. Not like before. The hospital report called his condition post-traumatic hallucination. The news called it a miracle survival. The families called it proof there were answers still buried in that canyon, but I wasn't sure what to call it. Every night after that, when the wind shifted down from the cliffs, I'd hear a faint hum in the distance, low, steady, familiar. And once, walking past the ranger station window, I saw the light flicker twice, as if someone had passed between the lamp and the glass. When I stepped inside, the room was empty, but the air smelled again of wet stone. It's strange how sound works in that part of the country. You can stand at the edge of something vast and still swear someone's whispering right behind you. Some nights I'd hear that same whisper now carried across the miles of rock, faint but clear enough to make me stop. I don't know what it says, maybe nothing at all, but it always sounds like a name. And even after all these years, I can't tell if it's calling for help or calling me back. Spring came again, as it always does out here, slow, stubborn, and a little cruel. The canyon turns green for a few weeks, the air softens, and for a moment you almost believe the land has forgiven what it took. But that year the thaw carried something different. A few hikers reported hearing voices near the lower rim, laughter sometimes, or a single name rising through the wind. We logged the calls same as we always do, but deep down, none of us needed the paperwork to know where they were hearing it from. It was coming from that hollow, the one we swore closed, the one the earth still remembers. Mark stayed in the ranger cabin for a while longer, though he wasn't really there. His body moved through the motions, coffee short walks, polite nods, but his mind never left the canyon. Every night, the same ritual. He'd sit outside just after sunset, notebook open, writing things none of us ever read. I asked him once what he was putting down. He said, "So I don't forget." I wanted to tell him that forgetting might be mercy, but I didn't. Some people need to hold the weight to stay standing. It was late July when I noticed the porch light at his cabin still burning well past dawn. I went up there thinking maybe he'd fallen asleep reading. The door was unlocked. Inside, the bed was made, dishes washed, floor swept clean. His jacket hung by the door, and on the table sat his notebook open to the last page. The writing was smaller than usual, almost cramped. It said, "Only she's calling. I hear her now." We searched the rim that day, then the trails, then the cliffs, below the overlook where he liked to sit. No footprints, no broken brush, no sign of struggle. Just the faint smell of rain on stone, though the sky hadn't seen a drop in weeks. The official report lists him as missing, presumed deceased. I wrote it myself, though the words didn't feel honest. It wasn't death, not in the way the world keeps count. He'd gone back to wherever the canyon had left a door open. After that, the families stopped coming as often. Sarah's mother moved to Flagstaff, closer to her other daughter. David's brother started a fund for missing hikers. Lena's father came one last time, sat by the memorial we built on the rim, and left a single climbing carabiner hooked to the plaque. He didn't speak a word. I think he knew words had already failed. Tessa transferred to Yellowstone the next spring. She said she needed distance, real distance. Before she left, she handed me a flash drive. It held her field notes, photos, and the recordings we'd made in the hollow, just in case, she said. I asked, "In case of what?" She shrugged, eyes down. "In case it starts again. I still haven't opened it. It sits in the bottom drawer of my desk next to the last photo of the four of them at the trailhead, the one with that strange fifth shadow at the edge. I used to think it was a trick of the light. I'm not so sure anymore. The canyon never gave us back the others. Every few years, erosion turns up something small, a button, a camera lens, a strip of nylon faded to gray, but never bones, never proof. Maybe that's its way of keeping secrets. There's a theory that time folds differently in places like this, that sound and memory can loop until they blur. Sometimes when storms roll through, I'll swear I hear the echo of laughter caught in the thunderlight, quick like Lena's. It's never loud. It's just enough to make me stop and listen. The Park Service put up a sign near Ribbon Falls after the case closed trail restricted unstable terrain. It's just a sheet of aluminum bolted to a post, but people obey it more out of feeling than rule. Even the locals avoid that stretch now. Hikers who wander too close say the air grows heavier, colder. Some claim they hear voices in the wind. I don't argue with them. There are things you stop trying to explain when you've watched logic lose. Years have passed, and still every time I step onto the porch before dawn, I see that same line of canyon cut dark against the east. The world moves on, it always does. New tourists come, new trails open, new stories rise to take the place of the old. But this one never left me. It sits under my ribs, quiet but awake the way grief settles once it stops burning. I used to think my job was about keeping people safe. Now I think it's about remembering the ones we couldn't. They put up a small memorial down by the south trailhead, 4 names engraved in bronze, and later I added a 5th. It doesn't say Mark. It just says the one who returned. Below that, a single line from his notes. Some places never let go. Visitors leave small things there: stones, wildflowers, folded maps, old film canisters. Most never ask what happened. Maybe they don't want to know. Maybe they already do. Sometimes I wonder what we'd find if we ever went back down there with better gear, better light, better reason. But part of me knows that place doesn't open for reason. It opens for people who think they can explain it, and then it keeps the part of them that can't. I don't say that out loud. I just tell the younger rangers to stay clear of the caves, and I leave the rest unsaid. Last fall, a tourist sent an email to the station. She'd taken a panoramic photo near the south rim, nothing unusual, just sunset over the cliffs. But when she zoomed in, she noticed 5 faint shapes near the ridge. 4 clustered close together, and 1 standing just apart, turned toward the canyon. She asked if we were running a training exercise that week. I told her no. It's easy to convince yourself that ghosts are just stories told to fill silence, but silence has weight too. When you've stood in a place that swallowed 4 lives and then 1 more, you start to understand how the past isn't really gone. It's just quieter now. Every sound that rises in those walls is carrying a piece of what came before. And every person who hears it becomes part of the story whether they want to or not. When I think of them now, I don't see the tents or the storm or the cave. I see that morning at the ranger station, the 4 of them leaning over the logbook, smiling, ready to begin. I remember Sarah asking how far the light reached in the canyon. Depends on the dust, I told her. That answer still feels right. The world only shows you what the air will allow. Maybe one day the canyon will close its doors for good. Maybe the wind will smooth out the whispers until nothing's left but silence. Or maybe that's wishful thinking. Some stories are built into the rock itself. They stay because the land needs them to, and maybe that's what the canyon was trying to tell us all along, that once you've walked its paths, a part of you always does. So I keep the porch light on at the station. It's habit now, though. No one's come through that door after dark in years. I tell myself it's for the night patrol, or the late hikers, or anyone who might need a little light to find their way back. But maybe it's for them. Maybe it's for the chance that one day one of those voices will reach the rim again, tired and human, calling home. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views or clicks, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. The canyon keeps its secrets, but we don't have to.